Chapter 5. The Visit. The School of the Arts' hard-working dance teacher, Miss Lydia Grant, knew she was tough on her kids, but then you had to be, so you could prepare them for the real world of professionalism, full of success and betrayal, failures and fame. It was a competitive racket out there, and in order for them to be able to stand up and face it, they needed criticism as well as the praise. Many of the students had pet names for her, such as the Dragon, but Lydia handled the problem, and anyway, out of all the teachers, she was found to be the most loved by her kids. Like any human being, she cared for her students, and whenever someone was hurting or needed assistance in any way, she was there to pick them up and put them back on their feet as best she could. Likewise, it was the same with the other teachers and their pupils. Miss Sherwood would be a lighthouse in the storm whenever her kids were sailing into trouble, and Mr. Shorofsky would do the same for his young up-and-coming musicians. However, the old professor was at present not in school due to suffering a heart attack, so he couldn't as yet offer help to his favourite pupil Bruno Martelli. So it was Miss Grant who'd taken over that role, and it was she who gave the talented piano player time off school so he could go and visit Mr. Shorofsky at Bellevue. Doris Schwartz pleaded for Miss Grant to let her go with him, and Lydia gave in. Otherwise, she knew she'd have a grumpy Doris moaning in class for the rest of the day. And Lydia was almost certain that she was close, perhaps even in love with Mr. Martelli, as she noticed that Doris was always by his side any chance she got. Miss Grant was curious to know more about Bruno and Doris's relationship, but decided it really wasn't any of her business and left it at that. Anyway, she knew that Doris Schwartz had a reputation of being a little gossip, so eventually it was bound to come out in the open. It was a few minutes after they'd refreshed themselves with lunch in the school's cafeteria, if you could call it refreshing, when Doris and Bruno made their way to their lockers to collect their coats, just in case it rained, while they were heading for the hospital. The two kids were just about to leave the school when Miss Davenport caught them at the top of the stairs leading to the large entrance. "And just where do you think you're going, Martelli?" It was always Martelli. Even if he was standing with the rest of the group, it was always, "Martelli, what are you doing?" or "Martelli, where are you going?" Doris answered, giving Miss Davenport one of her frowns. "We," she emphasised on that particular word, "are leaving the school because we've been given permission. If you don't believe us, just go and see Miss Grant. She gave us the permission." Doris waved a small slip of pink paper at the temporary tutor, and she took it and read it. Without a word, she handed it back to the young Jewish girl, then left them in her usual haughty nose-in-the-air manner. Doris smiled triumphantly, then looked at Bruno, who was watching Miss Davenport's retreating form, a look of uneasiness clearly displayed on his face. "Come on, Martelli, we win this one," she said, eyes widening in victory. Then she took his hand, and together they left the building and headed for the subway. When they reached Bellevue Hospital, they found the inquiries desk, discovered where Mr. Shorofsky was being kept, and made their way towards 6 on the 3rd floor. The moment they'd entered the place, the first thing that hit Bruno was the antiseptic smell. It was that sickly aroma which always put him off hospitals and made him feel queasy sometimes. Given half the chance, it was one locality he'd avoid visiting. Luckily, he'd never had to go to hospital for any reason, as he'd always been a very healthy kid. His worst illness had been chickenpox, but that was all. However, Bruno had visited friends in hospital, particularly one young female who would always remain in his memory. She'd been a brave young dancer who had been gifted with the ability to move like an angel, but she also had a crippling disease, namely multiple sclerosis. Bruno wondered where she was right now, that is, if she was still alive. He was thinking about her as they entered the correct ward, then Doris brought him back to the present day. "Martelli, he's over there," she said, indicating to where the old grey-haired music teacher lay in one of the beds. They went over and were pleased to notice that Mr. Shorofsky was looking very well. In fact, his cheeks were rosier than they'd ever been. He immediately recognised his young protégé and smiled. "Good afternoon, Mr. Martelli, and what brings you here?" He spied Doris by his side. "And you as well, Miss Schwartz. To what do I owe for such a visit?" "How are you feeling?" Bruno asked, not bothering to answer the question just yet. "Fit as a fiddle. Never felt better," Shorofsky mused, delighted to see his pupil had taken time to visit him. Does that mean you'll be teaching at the school soon? Bruno asked optimistically. Well, I'm not so sure. What I mean is, I feel well enough, but you know these doctors and nurses. They feel I need at least another week, Shorofsky said, not at all happy with the idea. Truth be known, he was very much looking forward to resuming his role as the honorary music professor at the School of the Arts. Another week? Mr. Shorofsky heard a definite tone of apprehension in Bruno's voice. Martelli, I know you're fond of your old music teacher, but why the look of depression, huh? Doris, who all this time had been listening to the conversation, decided to speak. Mr. Shorofsky, Bruno is going through a rough time, and it's not just because he misses you. Then what is it, Martelli? Shorofsky paused, then went on to another subject. How are you enjoying life with the new music teacher? Or aren't you enjoying life with the new music teacher? Bruno frowned. Mr. Shorofsky, I don't like the new music teacher. Oh? Shorofsky exclaimed, and why not? Bruno went on to tell him all the events that had occurred in the previous 2 weeks, and how Miss Davenport had constantly found fault with him whenever she could. Mr. Shorofsky listened intently, a concerned frown on his wrinkled face, until Bruno had finished his speech. Then he spoke. Well, Martelli, I must admit, while I was listening to your point of view, at first I thought this Miss Davenport was just a little stricter than myself, and that you just found it difficult to handle, since I believe I've always been fairly lenient with you, maybe a little too soft. Anyway, I've come to the conclusion that perhaps my first judgment was wrong. After all, from what you've said, this teacher sounds like she could be crippling you, not aiding you. So what are you going to do about it, Mr. Shorofsky? Doris asked impatiently. He began to sum up a solution, but before he could put it to them, Bruno reached into a canvas bag which was over his shoulder, took out some papers and handed them to his teacher. Please, would you mark these? Bruno asked confidently. Miss Davenport started to confuse me so that I'm not sure whether my work is good or bad anymore. Shorofsky took the proffered papers and began to look through them. While Bruno and Doris watched apprehensively, the old music teacher made a tick here and a cross there with a black pen. Then after several minutes he looked up and handed the papers back to his pupil. Bruno looked and noticed his professor had marked his work with a B+. Doris looked over his shoulder and she too saw the mark, then smiled at Shorofsky, who returned it most graciously. Have you got anything else for me, such as a bunch of grapes, love grapes, or apples? It dawned on the kids that they hadn't brought anything, but Doris came to the rescue. Fumbling around in a canvas bag, she found an apple which she'd meant to eat during break, but had forgotten about it. Instead, she handed it to Mr. Shorofsky. Will this do? She asked plaintively. Why, thank you, Miss Schwartz, Shorofsky replied, and took a bite out of it. Very tasty. Bruno had returned to his bag and had taken out another couple of papers, which he handed to his teacher. This has already been marked, he said, not wishing to go any further. Shorofsky looked at the grade his talented protégé had been given and frowned. An F, Martelli, he said, quite astonished, and began to look through it. Bruno felt extremely nervous, because half of him kept telling him that this particular piece of work was terrible, and therefore he didn't really want Mr. Shorofsky to see it. However, his mood changed to a feeling of great relief and self-satisfaction when Shorofsky said, That F should be an A, Martelli, and with his pen he corrected the mistake, which by now he knew had been deliberate. Martelli, why would this teacher give you false results? I do not understand. Has she got some sort of grudge against you? Bruno just couldn't answer the question, because he didn't know why Miss Davenport repeatedly jumped on him and criticised him. It puzzled him just as much as it puzzled Shorofsky. Well, Martelli, I certainly can't have this kind of behaviour from a teacher, Shorofsky began, but Doris cut him off. So what are you going to do? Miss Schwartz, I'm going to sort out this inconvenience and put things right. Mr. Shorofsky patted Bruno's hand affectionately. I can't have my young musician feeling miserable over such a matter. Bruno's face took on a look of total relief, and a large smile brightened his expression, making those blue-green eyes twinkle like stars in a night sky. Thank you, sir, he said. Think nothing of it, Martelli. It's obvious something needed to be done. Shorofsky replied, then offered him Doris's apple. Would you like a bite? No, thank you, Bruno replied, then turned to look at Doris, who took hold of his other hand. Suddenly he felt safe and secure now he was in the capable hands of Mr. Shorofsky. All the Davenports in the world couldn't hurt him now. They continued their stay with the old music teacher, but decided they'd better head back to the school, as it was Miss Sherwood's lesson, and she'd explained the week before that it was one not to be missed, as it involved a lot of diction which needed to be learnt for the end of the week. So by 3 o'clock they said their goodbyes, and Bruno and Doris made their way back to the School of the Arts. That evening Lydia Grant received a phone call from Mr. Shorofsky at her apartment. Together they discussed over the situation involving Bruno Martelli and the temporary tutor, Miss Davenport. Finally they came up with a conclusion that the woman was unfit to continue her job as a teacher. So the next day in the School of the Arts, a staff meeting was held excluding her, and plans were made to have her relieved of her responsibilities. However, the staff discovered through the School Board of Education that her post could not be altered until the following Monday, which meant she would continue to teach on the Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. But surely 3 days weren't going to make all that much difference.